Emily Carter had just lost the last place she could still call family, at 34. After years of being treated like the disappointment of the family, she sat through the reading of her grandmother's will while her relatives divided the valuable house, the savings, and every piece of land worth fighting over. When her name was finally called, the room fell silent before someone burst into laughter. All she inherited was a crumbling cottage hidden in the middle of an abandoned vineyard, a place everyone agreed was nothing more than a mountain of debt waiting to collapse. They told her to sell it before it cost her even more, but instead of walking away, Emily packed what little she owned and drove to the forgotten vineyard. 3 weeks later, while clearing decades of dust from the old wine cellar, she noticed one loose stone beneath a rusted wine rack. When she pulled it free, her hand touched a weathered leather ledger stamped with 2 faded words, Vintage Records. The first page carried a handwritten message from her grandmother, and as Emily turned to the next page, she realized these were not ordinary winemaking notes. They were hiding a secret someone had tried to erase for more than 60 years. But before we uncover what Emily found inside those mysterious records, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. If you're starting your morning, I wish you a wonderful day ahead. And if you're listening tonight, I hope this story keeps you company. Leave a comment to say hello. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with mystery, family secrets, and hidden legacies, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more unforgettable journeys. Emily Carter had learned long ago that disappointment rarely arrived with raised voices. More often, it came wrapped in polite smiles, legal documents, and the quiet certainty that she simply did not matter enough to be remembered. The conference room of Harper & Wells' law office overlooked the gray skyline of Portland, its tall windows reflecting the heavy clouds gathering outside. Around the polished oak table sat the remaining members of the Bennett family, each dressed in dark colors that suggested grief, though most had already shifted their attention from mourning to inheritance. Emily sat near the end of the table, hands folded tightly in her lap, saying little. She had not spoken to most of these relatives in years. After choosing culinary school instead of the accounting career her parents had wanted, she had gradually become the family disappointment. The niece who worked impossible hours in restaurant kitchens, never earned enough money, and seemed incapable of making what everyone else considered sensible decisions. Only her grandmother, Rose Bennett, had continued calling every Sunday evening, asking about new recipes instead of promotions, encouraging Emily to believe that feeding people was every bit as honorable as managing numbers. Now Rose was gone. The silence she left behind felt larger than the room itself. Attorney Harold Whitmore adjusted his glasses before opening the final folder. Mrs. Rose Bennett's estate has been divided according to her wishes. Emily barely listened as the lawyer listed the family home, investment accounts, jewelry, and parcels of productive vineyard land. Each item was assigned to an aunt, an uncle, or one of her older cousins. Every announcement was met with restrained nods and murmured appreciation. Emily expected nothing. She had come only because the letter requested her presence. Finally, Harold cleared his throat. To her granddaughter, Emily Carter, several heads turned toward her for the first time all morning. Mrs. Bennett leaves the property known as Willow Creek Cottage, including the abandoned vineyard surrounding it. The room remained silent for only a heartbeat before someone laughed. It was her cousin Brian. Seriously? That old place? Another relative shook his head with a sympathetic smile. Rose always was sentimental. Emily frowned. She remembered visiting the vineyard as a child only once. Endless rows of vines stretched across gentle hills, and at the center stood a small stone cottage covered with climbing ivy. Her grandmother had stopped bringing her after Emily turned 10, saying the place required more work than she could manage alone. There's almost nothing left there, Aunt Denise said casually. The vineyard hasn't produced a commercial harvest in years. The roof leaks, Brian added. The cellar floods every winter. Someone farther down the table chuckled. Congratulations! You inherited taxes. Laughter spread around the room. Never loud enough to seem openly cruel, yet sharp enough that Emily felt every word. Harold slid a small envelope across the table. Mrs. Bennet left a letter requesting that this key be given directly to Miss Carter. Inside rested an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag. The handwriting was unmistakably Rose's. Willow Creek Cottage. Emily closed her fingers around it. No one asked whether she planned to keep the place. They assumed she would sell it immediately. As the meeting ended, relatives gathered in small groups discussing appraisals, renovations, and market prices. Brian approached Emily while putting on his expensive coat. You know, if someone offers anything for that place, take it. Trust me, it'll save you months of headaches. Emily managed a faint smile. Maybe. He shrugged and walked away before waiting for an answer. Outside, cold rain had begun to fall. Emily sat inside her aging hatchback, turning the old key over in her palm. Financially, selling the property would make sense. Her restaurant had recently reduced staff hours. Rent continued climbing. Her savings barely covered 2 months of expenses. Yet she kept hearing her grandmother's gentle voice. Sometimes the things worth keeping don't look valuable at first. 2 days later, Emily packed everything she owned into the back of her car and drove toward the valley where Willow Creek Cottage waited. The highway gradually gave way to narrow country roads, winding between rolling hills covered in neglected vineyards and scattered farms. Autumn had already painted the leaves with shades of amber and crimson when she finally reached the rusted entrance gate. She stopped the car and stared. Time had not been kind to the property. The wooden sign bearing Willow Creek Vineyard leaned sideways. Wild vines climbed over broken fencing. Tall grass swallowed what had once been neat walking paths. At the center of it all stood the cottage. Though weathered, the old stone walls remained standing proudly beneath a moss-covered roof. Ivy climbed around the windows, softening years of neglect. Emily stepped from the car, breathing in cool air scented with damp earth and distant grapes. Despite everything, the place felt strangely peaceful. She unlocked the front door. It resisted before opening with a long groan. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight. Furniture remained exactly where someone had left it years ago. A knitted blanket rested over an old rocking chair. Copper pots still hung in the kitchen. A faded family photograph stood on the fireplace mantel. It was as though Rose had simply stepped outside for a moment. Emily spent the afternoon opening windows, sweeping away leaves that had blown inside. And carrying in a few boxes, the practical work helped quiet the emotions she had tried to ignore since the funeral. As evening approached, footsteps sounded outside. Emily turned to see an older man standing near the porch, carrying a basket filled with apples. His weathered face broke into a gentle smile beneath the brim of a worn hat. "You must be Emily," he said. "I'm Daniel Hayes. Your grandmother always said you'd come back one day." Emily accepted the basket with surprise. "You knew Rose well." Daniel nodded. "Worked these vines for nearly 30 years. His eyes drifted toward the neglected rows stretching across the hillside. "People will be coming soon, offering to buy this place. They'll tell you it's worthless." Emily smiled weakly. "Most of my family already has." Daniel looked directly at her. "Don't make any decisions too quickly." Before Emily could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and walked slowly back toward the neighboring property. The last light faded behind the hills. Alone once more, Emily carried a flashlight through the cottage until she reached an old wooden door leading beneath the house. The cellar stairs creaked under each careful step. Cool air surrounded her, carrying the unmistakable scent of aged oak and forgotten wine. Rows of dusty shelves stretched into the darkness. Many bottles were missing, but countless others remained untouched beneath decades of dust. Near the back wall, partially hidden behind a stack of empty crates, stood an old wooden desk. Resting on top of it was a thick, leather-bound book. Emily brushed away the dust with trembling fingers. The cover bore no title. She opened it carefully. On the first page, written in her grandmother's elegant handwriting, were the words, "If you're reading this, you are the last keeper of our harvest." Emily Carter had long ago discovered that heartbreak rarely arrived with dramatic arguments or slammed doors. More often it came wrapped in polite smiles, carefully chosen words, and quiet reminders that she simply didn't belong. The conference room at Harper & Wells' law office felt strangely warm despite the cold rain tapping against the tall windows. Around the polished oak table sat the remaining members of the Bennett family, dressed in black, speaking softly enough to resemble mourning while their attention lingered on the folders neatly arranged before the attorney. Emily sat near the far end of the table, with her hands folded together. She had not spoken to most of her relatives in years. After choosing culinary school instead of a stable corporate career, she had gradually become the family disappointment. Her cousins had built successful businesses. Her aunts proudly discussed retirement plans and investment portfolios. Emily spent 12-hour shifts in restaurant kitchens, returned home smelling of garlic and smoke, and barely earned enough to cover rent in Portland. Only one person had ever made her feel that none of those comparisons mattered. Every Sunday evening, without fail, her grandmother Rose had called simply to ask what Emily had cooked that week. Rose never cared about promotions, salaries, or titles. She cared about flavors, kindness, and whether Emily still loved what she was doing. Now those Sunday phone calls were gone forever. Attorney Harold Whitmore adjusted his glasses before opening the final folder. Mrs. Rose Bennett's estate has been distributed according to her wishes. One by one, valuable assets were assigned. The family home went to Emily's Aunt Denise. Productive vineyard acreage was divided among 2 cousins. Savings accounts, antique furniture, jewelry, and investment funds all found eager recipients. Emily listened quietly, without disappointment. She had never expected to inherit anything. She had come because Rose would have wanted her there. Finally, Harold glanced toward her. To her granddaughter, Emily Carter. Several relatives looked up for the first time all morning. Mrs. Bennett leaves Willow Creek Cottage, together with the surrounding abandoned vineyard. Silence hung in the room for only a second before Brian, Emily's oldest cousin, laughed aloud. "You're kidding." Another cousin smirked. "That's probably the most expensive problem in the county." Aunt Denise offered what sounded almost like sympathy. Rose always held on to that place for sentimental reasons. "It hasn't made money in years," Brian added. "The vines are dying." "The roof leaks. You'll spend more fixing it than it's worth," someone else quietly joked. "Congratulations, you inherited weeds." Soft laughter spread around the room. No one sounded intentionally cruel, yet no one tried to hide their amusement either. Emily remembered visiting Willow Creek only once as a child. Endless rows of grapevines rolled across gentle hills beneath the afternoon sun. Her grandmother had shown her how to recognize ripe fruit and had packed fresh bread beneath the shade of an old oak tree. It had been one of the happiest days Emily could remember. After that summer, Rose rarely invited anyone there again. Harold slid a small envelope across the table. Mrs. Bennett specifically requested this be given only to Miss Carter. Emily opened it carefully. Inside rested an old brass key attached to a worn leather tag. The faded handwriting read simply, Willow Creek Cottage. She wrapped her fingers around it without speaking. Brian leaned toward her as everyone gathered their belongings. Seriously, sell it. If anyone's willing to buy that place, take the money before it falls apart. Emily forced a small smile. Maybe I'll look at it first. Brian shrugged. Suit yourself. Within minutes, the room emptied. Emily remained seated alone, staring at the key. Financially, selling the property made perfect sense. The restaurant where she worked had recently cut employee hours because business had slowed. Her savings account barely covered a couple of months of living expenses. Owning an abandoned vineyard sounded less like an opportunity than another burden she couldn't afford. Yet she couldn't ignore one simple question. Why had Rose left it specifically to her? 2 mornings later, Emily loaded everything she owned into her aging hatchback. A few boxes of clothes, kitchen knives wrapped in towels, several cookbooks, and a suitcase were all that fit inside. Leaving Portland behind, she drove south through rolling countryside where autumn had already painted the vineyards gold and crimson. As the highway narrowed into quiet country roads, familiar memories slowly returned. She recognized distant hills she had forgotten existed and finally reached a rusted iron gate nearly hidden beneath climbing vines. A weathered wooden sign still stood beside it, Willow Creek Vineyard. Several letters had faded almost beyond recognition. Emily stepped from the car. Cool air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Beyond the gate stretched rows of neglected vines tangled with wild growth. At the center stood the cottage. Time had left its mark. Moss covered sections of the stone roof. Ivy climbed around old windows. One shutter hung crookedly. Yet despite years of neglect, the cottage remained standing with quiet dignity, as though patiently waiting for someone to return. Unlocking the front door required both hands and several determined attempts before the old lock finally turned. The door creaked open. Dust drifted through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight. Everything inside seemed frozen in another time. Copper pots still hung neatly above the stove. A knitted blanket rested across an old rocking chair. Books filled wooden shelves beside a stone fireplace. Rose's reading glasses remained folded on a side table, exactly where she had apparently left them. Emily slowly walked through each room, touching familiar objects she hadn't seen since childhood. She found herself smiling despite the sadness pressing against her chest. The cottage needed work. Windows refused to open. Dust covered nearly every surface. Dead leaves had blown through small gaps beneath the doors. She spent several hours cleaning what she could, opening shutters, sweeping floors, and carrying in the few boxes from her car. Practical tasks kept her mind occupied. By late afternoon, while struggling to move an old wooden table closer to the kitchen wall, she heard footsteps outside. An older man wearing a faded work jacket approached the porch carrying a basket filled with bright red apples. His weathered face softened into a warm smile. "You must be Emily." "I am." "Daniel Hayes." He extended the basket toward her. "Your grandmother always sent me home with something from the garden. Seemed only right I returned the favor." Emily accepted the apples gratefully. "Thank you. You knew Rose well." Daniel nodded. Worked these vineyards beside her for nearly 30 years. His eyes wandered across the neglected fields before returning to Emily. "I'm sorry for your loss." "I still can't quite believe she's gone." "Neither can I." For a moment, both stood quietly, listening to the wind rustle through abandoned vines. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "You'll probably have visitors soon." "Visitors?" "People interested in buying this place." Emily gave a tired smile. "My family already thinks that's exactly what I should do." Daniel's expression grew unexpectedly serious. "Don't rush." Emily studied him curiously. "Is there a reason?" He hesitated before answering. Your grandmother held on to this land for a reason. That's all I'll say." Before Emily could ask another question, Daniel tipped his hat politely. "If you need tools or help fixing anything, my farm's just over the hill." "Thank you." He walked away at an unhurried pace until disappearing beyond a row of old maple trees. Evening settled quietly across the valley. After preparing a simple sandwich for dinner, Emily continued exploring the cottage. Near the back hallway, she found a heavy wooden door leading downstairs. She switched on her flashlight before carefully descending worn stone steps into the cellar. Cool air immediately surrounded her, carrying the rich scent of oak barrels, old cork, and aging wine. Wooden racks lined the walls, holding dozens of dusty bottles untouched for years. Some shelves stood empty, while others remained surprisingly full. Near the rear corner sat an old writing desk, partially hidden behind stacked wooden crates. Curiosity drew Emily closer. Resting on the desk lay a thick, leather-bound ledger covered in dust. She brushed the cover gently with her sleeve. There was no title, only worn brown leather cracked by age. She opened it carefully. The first page contained a single sentence written in the elegant handwriting she knew better than almost anyone's. "If you're reading this, you are the last keeper of our harvest." Emily stood motionless in the dim cellar, her flashlight resting on the open ledger. The familiar elegance of her grandmother's handwriting made it feel less like reading an old book and more like hearing Rose's voice again after weeks of silence. "If you're reading this, you are the last keeper of our harvest." She whispered the sentence aloud, letting each word settle into the stillness around her. It sounded less like an introduction and more like a responsibility. She carefully turned the page, expecting recipes or production notes from an old family vineyard. Instead, she found a neatly ruled table with 4 handwritten headings: vintage, rainfall, harvest, and name. The first entry read 1961, rainfall light, harvest excellent, name Margaret Ellis, beneath it. Rose had added a single sentence: delivered 12 bottles after the frost, refused payment. Emily frowned. The next page followed the same pattern: 1962, harvest fair, name Thomas Reed. His children stayed on the farm another year. Another year carried another unfamiliar name, another short note. None described flavors, barrels, or fermentation. Every page recorded a person. Every harvest seemed connected to someone's life rather than the wine itself. Emily slowly closed the book. "What were you writing, Grandma?" The cellar offered only silence. She looked around with fresh curiosity. Wooden shelves stretched along every wall, supporting hundreds of dusty wine bottles arranged with remarkable precision. Most wore faded handwritten labels instead of commercial branding. Many dated back decades. The collection was far larger than she had expected from a vineyard everyone claimed had stopped producing years ago. She picked up one bottle carefully. Thick dust covered the glass. But beneath it, she could still read the label: Autumn Reserve, 1974. No company logo, no price, only the year and Rose's handwriting. She returned it gently to its place. Whatever this cellar had once been, it had never operated like a typical winery. The next morning, Emily woke before sunrise beneath 3 heavy blankets. The cottage had no central heating anymore, and the chill of the valley had settled into every stone wall overnight. She brewed coffee using an old enamel kettle she found in the kitchen, then carried the warm mug onto the front porch. Morning mist drifted across the abandoned vineyard. Birds called from distant trees while dew sparkled on tangled grapevines that had not been properly trimmed in years. The beauty of the landscape contrasted sharply with the amount of work waiting for her. Several fence posts leaned dangerously. Gutters sagged beneath accumulated leaves. One section of roof clearly needed repairs before winter storms arrived. Emily sighed quietly. She had inherited far more responsibility than property. After breakfast, she returned to practical work. She opened every window to let fresh air circulate through the cottage, wiped dust from furniture, and sorted boxes left untouched for years. Every room revealed another reminder of Rose's life: an apron hanging behind the kitchen door, gardening gloves folded beside the sink, shelves lined with homemade preserves whose labels had faded almost white. The discoveries made the empty house feel strangely alive. Around midday, she returned to the cellar, carrying fresh cloths and a notebook of her own. She wanted to understand exactly what remained there. Bottle by bottle, shelf by shelf, she counted the collection. Some corks had deteriorated with age, but many bottles appeared remarkably well preserved. She carefully copied dates and labels into her notebook. Whenever she found a vintage mentioned inside the ledger, she noticed at least one bottle from the same year still resting nearby. It could not be coincidence. By early afternoon, someone knocked gently on the open front door. Daniel Hayes stood outside holding a small wooden toolbox. "Thought you might need this," he said with an easy smile. Emily welcomed him inside. "You're saving me another trip into town." "Your grandmother hated borrowing tools," Daniel replied, setting the box near the kitchen table. "So I figured I'd lend them before you asked." Emily laughed for the first time since arriving. "That sounds like her." Daniel looked around the cottage, noticing freshly cleaned windows and swept floors. "You've already brought some life back into the place." "Trying to." She hesitated before speaking again. "I found something in the cellar." Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "The old wine." "More than that." She retrieved the leather ledger and placed it gently on the table. Daniel stared at the cover without touching it. "I haven't seen that book in years." "Do you know what it is?" He remained quiet for several seconds before answering. "Your grandmother called it her vintage record." Emily opened several pages. "These aren't winemaking notes. They're names, people, short messages." Daniel adjusted his glasses and studied one entry from across the table. A faint smile crossed his face. "Margaret Ellis. You knew her?" "Everyone around here did." He looked toward the window overlooking the vineyard. "Good woman." Emily waited, hoping he would explain further. Instead, he simply closed the ledger. "Rose always believed every harvest told a story." "What kind of story?" Daniel smiled gently. "One she thought deserved remembering." It was not really an answer, but Emily sensed he had already said as much as he intended. They spent the next hour replacing broken cabinet hinges and repairing a loose porch railing. Working together came easily. Daniel rarely wasted words, yet his quiet presence made the lonely cottage feel less isolated. Before leaving, he paused beside the front gate. "Has anyone else stopped by?" "No." "They will." "My family—" Daniel shook his head. "Maybe not." He looked back toward the vineyard. "This land attracts attention whenever people hear someone new owns it. Because they think it's valuable?" "Because most believe it isn't." His answer puzzled Emily even more. Late that afternoon, the sound of tires crunching across gravel interrupted her work. A black luxury SUV rolled slowly through the open gate before stopping beside the cottage. A tall man in an expensive charcoal coat stepped out, his polished shoes already gathering dust from the old driveway. He offered a courteous smile that looked carefully practiced. "Miss Carter?" "Yes." He extended his hand. "Victor Langford." Emily recognized the name immediately. Langford Estates produced some of the region's most successful wines. Their bottles appeared in restaurants across the state, including the one where she worked. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Victor said. I heard the property had changed hands and wanted to introduce myself personally. Emily shook his hand politely. What can I do for you? Victor glanced toward the neglected vineyard before returning his attention to her. I'll be honest, maintaining a property like this is extremely expensive. Emily smiled faintly. I've noticed. I'd be happy to relieve you of that burden. He removed a business card from his wallet. My company has been interested in this parcel for some time. She accepted the card without responding. Victor continued smoothly. I'd offer a very fair price, far more than this place is currently worth. Emily looked across the rows of abandoned vines swaying gently in the breeze. Only yesterday she might have accepted immediately, but now the leather ledger rested inside the cottage, filled with names and stories she did not understand. I appreciate the offer, she replied carefully, but I only arrived yesterday. Of course, Victor maintained his pleasant smile. Take a little time, though properties like this rarely improve with age. I'll think about it. He nodded politely before returning to his vehicle. If you decide to sell, call me before speaking with anyone else. Emily watched the SUV disappear down the narrow road until only dust remained. She slipped the business card into her pocket without looking at it again. That evening, she carried the ledger back into the cellar. The quiet room somehow felt different now that someone had already tried to buy the vineyard. She reopened the book and slowly turned several pages. The pattern continued without exception. A harvest, a name, a brief handwritten note. She reached the middle of the ledger before something finally broke the rhythm. Several pages had been torn out cleanly near the binding. Emily gently touched the rough edges where they had once been. Someone had deliberately removed them. She stared at the empty gap, wondering what stories had disappeared along with those missing pages. Emily slept only a few hours. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the torn edges inside the leather ledger and heard her grandmother's handwritten words repeating in her mind. You are the last keeper of our harvest. By sunrise, she was already back in the cellar with a flashlight, a notebook, and a pair of work gloves. If someone had deliberately removed pages from the ledger, perhaps there were other records hidden somewhere nearby. The cellar was larger than she had first realized. Rows of bottle racks extended into dim corners where decades of dust had softened every outline. She slowly walked along each wall, tapping wooden shelves and examining the stonework between them. Most of the room felt solid, but behind the oldest rack in the far corner, her knuckles produced a dull, hollow sound. Emily stopped. She tapped again. Hollow. Unlike the thick stone surrounding it, this section echoed faintly. She pushed against the heavy wine rack. It barely moved. Years of dust and the weight of hundreds of bottles held it firmly in place. Careful not to disturb the bottles, she removed them one by one, placing each on a nearby table. It took nearly an hour before the shelves were finally light enough to shift. With a long scrape across the stone floor, the rack moved just enough to reveal a narrow wooden door hidden behind it. Emily stared in disbelief. The door blended almost perfectly into the surrounding wall. Without moving the wine rack, she would never have noticed it. There was no lock, only a simple iron handle, darkened with age. She hesitated briefly before pulling it open. Cool air drifted from the darkness beyond. Her flashlight revealed a small storage room no larger than a garden shed. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Unlike the main cellar, this room held almost no wine bottles. Instead, dozens of leather-bound ledgers rested neatly in chronological order. Emily slowly stepped inside. Every book looked almost identical to the first one she had found. Some leather covers were cracked with age, while others appeared surprisingly well preserved. She reached for the nearest volume. Vintage Records, 1968 to 1972. Another read, 1973 to 1977. Then another, 1978 to 1982. There were enough books to document decades of harvests. "Grandma," she whispered, "what were you keeping?" She carried 3 of the ledgers into the main cellar and placed them beside the original book. The careful organization immediately caught her attention. Each volume continued where the previous one ended, whatever Rose had been recording. She had documented it faithfully, year after year. Emily opened one from the late 70s. Once again, every harvest listed weather conditions, production notes, and then a person's name followed by a brief handwritten remark. 1975, heavy spring rain. Eleanor Brooks. Her husband recovered before harvest ended. 1976, mild season. Samuel Ortiz. The loan remained private. Emily frowned. None of these notes explained themselves, yet every sentence hinted at events far larger than winemaking. Around noon, she locked the cottage and drove into the nearest town. If anyone could help her understand the handwriting and preserve the aging ledgers, it would be someone experienced with historical documents. The town library occupied an old brick building overlooking the square. After describing what she had found to the librarian, Emily received a recommendation almost immediately. "You should speak with Sophia Morales," the librarian said. "She restores historical records for the county museum. If anyone can read damaged journals, it's Sophia." Emily found Sophia working inside a modest restoration studio attached to the museum. Shelves filled with carefully preserved maps, letters, and photographs surrounded a large wooden work table. Sophia looked to be in her early 30s, wearing magnifying glasses pushed onto her forehead and cotton gloves stained with old paper dust. She welcomed Emily warmly after hearing about the ledgers. "May I?" Sophia asked gently. Emily handed her the earliest volume. Sophia opened it with practiced care. "Beautiful handwriting," she murmured. "Your grandmother took excellent care of these." She examined several pages before smiling thoughtfully. "The ink is consistent. The paper quality is exceptional. These books were meant to last." Emily pointed toward one of the entries. "Can you make sense of these notes?" Sophia adjusted the page beneath a reading lamp. "Some abbreviations are old agricultural shorthand, but these comments aren't about grapes." She traced one sentence lightly, without touching the paper. "Delivered after the flood. Refused payment. Children remained through winter." These sound almost like personal records. Emily nodded. "That's exactly what confuses me." Sophia carefully turned several pages. "Notice something else?" Emily leaned closer. "Every year begins with weather observations." "Yes," Sophia smiled. "And immediately afterward comes a person's name. Your grandmother clearly believed the harvest and these people's lives were connected somehow." Emily remained silent. She had noticed the same pattern, but hearing someone else confirm it made the mystery feel more real. Sophia continued examining the handwriting. "I'd be happy to help preserve these books. We should digitize them eventually, but first I'd recommend photographing every page exactly as they are." Emily agreed. Before leaving, Sophia handed her a small archival notebook. "Write down every question you have while reading. Sometimes patterns appear only after enough details are collected." Emily thanked her and returned to Willow Creek before sunset. Inspired by Sophia's advice, she spent the evening comparing multiple ledgers side by side across the kitchen table. Years passed. Harvests changed. Weather shifted between drought and abundance. Yet one thing remained constant. Every vintage connected to ordinary people rather than customers or wine distributors. Some names appeared only once. Others returned several years apart. Occasionally, Rose added longer observations. The vines survived. So did she. He insisted on paying. I accepted $1. Promise kept. Emily searched old maps she found in the cottage and recognized several family names still living in the valley today. These were not strangers. They belonged to generations of local farming families. As darkness settled outside, Emily carried another stack of ledgers back toward the cellar. While returning one volume to the hidden storage room, something slipped from inside the back cover and landed softly on the floor. She knelt and picked it up. Folded tightly between two pages was a small piece of yellowed paper. Carefully unfolding it, she discovered it was not a letter, but a hand-drawn map. The ink had faded, yet several landmarks remained visible. The cottage, the vineyard rows, the creek beyond the orchard. Near the lower corner, a small circle had been drawn beside an unfamiliar section of the cellar with a single handwritten mark beside it. Emily stared at the tiny map, realizing she had just uncovered another clue her grandmother had hidden inside the vintage records. Emily unfolded the small, hand-drawn map across the kitchen table and weighted its corners with 4 empty coffee mugs. Morning sunlight poured through the cottage windows, revealing details she had missed the night before. The sketch was simple but precise. Rose had outlined the cottage, the old vineyard, the creek that curved behind the property, and the cellar beneath the house. A narrow line led toward a small circle drawn beyond the hidden record room Emily had already discovered. Next to the circle, Rose had written only one word: reserve. There was no explanation, no date, and no instructions. Emily copied the map into her notebook before carefully folding the original and returning it to the ledger where she had found it. If her grandmother had hidden the drawing inside one of the vintage records, she wanted to keep everything exactly where Rose had intended. After gathering a flashlight, work gloves, and a pry bar from Daniel's toolbox, she returned to the cellar. The hidden record room looked exactly as she had left it. Shelves of leather-bound ledgers lined the walls in careful order, untouched by time. Emily compared the map with the stone floor beneath her feet. According to Rose's drawing, the marked location should have been beyond the back wall of the storage room, yet all she saw was solid stone. She slowly examined each section, running her hands across rough mortar and weathered blocks. Most felt cold and unyielding. Then her fingers brushed a wooden support beam standing beside the last shelf. Unlike the others, it showed fresh scratches near its base, as though someone had moved it many years ago. Emily pushed against the beam. Nothing happened. She pulled instead. With a low, grinding sound hidden beneath years of dust, part of the shelving shifted several inches. Behind it appeared another narrow doorway, almost invisible within the stone wall. Emily smiled despite herself. "You really didn't make this easy." "Grandma?" She squeezed through the opening with her flashlight. The passage beyond descended 3 shallow steps before opening into another underground chamber. Unlike the record room, this space felt dry and remarkably clean. Wooden racks stretched along both walls, each holding carefully stored wine bottles arranged in perfect rows. Every bottle rested horizontally inside its own compartment. Thick dust covered the shelves, but not the glass itself, suggesting someone had cleaned them before sealing the room. Emily slowly walked between the rows. She counted nearly 200 bottles. None carried commercial labels. Each displayed only handwritten tags tied around the neck with faded string. Autumn Reserve, Winter Blend, Founder's Harvest. Every vintage dated back decades. She reached for one bottle labeled 1981. The cork remained intact beneath untouched wax. Whatever Rose had preserved here had been protected with extraordinary care. Emily searched the room for anything explaining why these bottles had been hidden separately from the rest of the cellar. She found no accounting books, no inventory sheets, and no signs that anyone had intended to sell them. Instead, The room felt almost ceremonial, as though every bottle represented something worth remembering rather than something worth drinking. While examining the final shelf, she noticed one bottle positioned differently from the others. Its neck extended slightly beyond the rack. Curious. She carefully lifted it free. The label simply read 1984. No additional notes. As she turned the bottle in her hands, something inside shifted. With a soft scrape against the glass, Emily held it toward the flashlight. A tightly rolled piece of paper rested inside the empty space above the wine. Her pulse quickened. The bottle had never been opened. The wax seal remained unbroken. Rose must have placed the message inside before corking it decades earlier. Emily carried the bottle upstairs and spent nearly an hour studying it before attempting anything. She refused to damage either the bottle or its contents. Finally, using a thin corkscrew and extraordinary patience, she eased the cork free without breaking it. The faint aroma of aged wine filled the kitchen. Tilting the bottle carefully, she coaxed the tiny rolled paper toward the opening until it finally slipped into her waiting hand. The note had yellowed with age, but remained perfectly readable. It contained only a few handwritten lines. If this bottle has reached you, then you chose curiosity over convenience. Some harvests are too important to measure by profit. Remember that before anyone convinces you otherwise. Rose. Emily read the message twice before folding it carefully. It still explained very little. Yet it confirmed one thing beyond doubt. Her grandmother had expected someone, specifically Emily, to find this room someday. As she replaced the bottle, the sound of an approaching vehicle echoed across the quiet valley. She stepped outside to see the familiar black SUV rolling slowly toward the cottage once again. Victor Langford climbed out, carrying no briefcase this time, only a pleasant smile. "Miss Carter," he called. "I hope I'm not becoming a nuisance." Emily met him near the porch. "You're back sooner than I expected." Business sometimes rewards quick decisions. He glanced across the vineyard. "Have you had time to think about my offer?" "I've had time to look around." Victor nodded politely. "And you've probably discovered how much work this property needs." Emily did not answer. He continued in the same calm voice. "Restoring abandoned vineyards costs far more than most people imagine. New trellises, soil recovery, equipment, labor. It becomes overwhelming very quickly. Maybe my company already has the resources." He removed a folded document from his coat pocket. "I'm prepared to increase my original offer." Emily looked at the paper but made no attempt to take it. "That's generous." "Practical," Victor corrected gently. "This place deserves someone capable of preserving it." Emily remembered Rose's note hidden inside the sealed bottle. "Some harvests are too important to measure by profit." "I appreciate your concern," she said quietly, "but I'm not ready to sell." Victor studied her for several long seconds before slipping the document back into his pocket. His smile never disappeared, though it seemed slightly more restrained now. "Take all the time you need. My offer remains open." He tipped his head politely and returned to the waiting SUV. Emily watched him drive away until the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees. She remained standing on the porch long after the dust had settled. Daniel's words returned to her. "Your grandmother held on to this land for a reason." Rose's hidden note echoed beside them. Curiosity over convenience. Neither explained why Victor seemed so determined to buy a vineyard everyone else considered worthless. That evening, after carefully returning every bottle to its proper place, Emily examined the handwritten message one final time before placing it inside the first ledger for safekeeping. As she slid the book onto the kitchen table, something else caught her eye. The bottle she had opened rested beside the lamp, now completely empty. Looking through the clear glass from the opposite side, she noticed a second object still lodged deep within the base. She tipped the bottle toward the light. It was not another note. It was a tiny brass key wrapped in faded cloth. Emily turned the empty bottle carefully beneath the kitchen lamp until the small brass key slid close enough to the neck for her to retrieve it with a pair of long cooking tweezers. It was no longer than the tip of her thumb, wrapped in a strip of faded linen that had protected it from the wine for decades. There was no tag, no marking, only a tiny number 7 etched into one side. She placed the key beside Rose's handwritten note and studied them together. Neither explained the other. The note had urged curiosity over convenience, and now another clue rested quietly beside it, waiting for its purpose to become clear. Rather than searching the cottage blindly, Emily slipped the key into the small envelope that had originally held the cottage key. If Rose had hidden it so carefully, there would be a moment when it made sense. Until then, she would be patient. Before breakfast, she reopened the earliest vintage record and copied every unfamiliar name into the archival notebook Sophia had given her. Margaret Ellis, Thomas Reed, Eleanor Brooks, Samuel Ortiz. Dozens of names stretched across decades, each accompanied by a sentence that felt less like bookkeeping than memory. As she read them again, one thought became impossible to ignore. Most of these families still lived somewhere in the valley. If the ledgers would not explain themselves, perhaps the people would. Emily drove into town carrying only her notebook. She stopped first at the small grocery store where Daniel had once pointed out several long-time residents. When she asked whether anyone remembered Margaret Ellis, the cashier smiled immediately. "Mrs. Ellis. Her daughter still lives on Maple Road." Emily thanked her and continued through the quiet valley. Maple Road wound between orchards and modest farmhouses before ending at a white farmhouse surrounded by vegetable gardens. An elderly woman answered the door with cautious curiosity. "Can I help you?" Emily introduced herself. "My name is Emily Carter. My grandmother was Rose Bennett." The woman's expression softened almost instantly. "Rose." She smiled warmly. "Please come in." They sat at a small kitchen table while tea steeped between them. Emily opened her notebook. "I found your mother's name inside one of my grandmother's records. I hoped you might know why." The woman laughed softly, though her eyes quickly grew moist. "My mother never talked much about accepting help." She looked toward an old family photograph hanging nearby. "The spring frost destroyed nearly our entire vineyard. We thought we'd lose everything. Then Rose arrived with 12 bottles of her best wine." Emily remembered the exact ledger entry. "Delivered 12 bottles after the frost. Refused payment." "Did she sell them to you?" The woman shook her head. "She insisted we take them to a charity auction in the city. Those bottles brought enough money to keep our farm alive until the next harvest." Emily looked down at her notebook. "She never accepted payment." "Not a penny." The woman smiled again. "Mother spent years trying to repay her. Rose always refused." Emily thanked her before leaving. As she drove away, the sentence inside the ledger no longer seemed mysterious. It had been a brief summary of a family's turning point. By afternoon, she visited another address. Thomas Reed's grandson now operated a small apple orchard outside town. The man welcomed Emily after hearing Rose's name. "Your grandmother saved my grandfather," he said simply. Emily listened as he explained that a serious injury had left Thomas unable to work during harvest season. Rose had quietly organized neighboring growers to harvest his grapes before they spoiled. "Granddad always said she made everyone believe it was their own idea." Emily smiled. "That sounds like her." "She never wanted credit." Emily wrote carefully while he spoke. Every conversation matched another line inside the vintage records. The entries were not symbolic. They described real people and real moments. None mentioned money directly, yet every story involved practical kindness offered without expectation of recognition. Late that afternoon, she visited the Brooks family. Eleanor Brooks had passed away years earlier, but her son invited Emily onto the porch, overlooking fields now planted with lavender instead of grapes. When Emily mentioned the ledger, he disappeared inside and returned carrying an old wooden box. From it, he removed a faded photograph. Rose stood beside Eleanor in front of Willow Creek Cottage, both smiling while holding baskets overflowing with grapes. On the back of the picture, Eleanor had written only one sentence. "She reminded me that asking for help is not the same as giving up." Emily stared quietly at the photograph. She had never seen this side of her grandmother. At family gatherings, Rose had always seemed gentle, almost reserved. Yet throughout the valley she appeared to have quietly woven herself into countless lives without ever speaking about it afterward. As the sun lowered, Emily stopped beside the small cemetery where Rose now rested. She carried no flowers, only the notebook filled with names and stories gathered throughout the day. Sitting on a nearby bench, she spoke aloud, despite knowing no answer would come. "You never told me any of this." Wind moved softly through nearby oak trees. "They all remember you," Emily whispered, "not because of the wine, because you never let them face hard times alone." For the first time since arriving at Willow Creek, Emily no longer felt she had inherited only land and old buildings. She had inherited relationships that had quietly survived decades. That realization filled her with equal parts gratitude and responsibility. Returning to the cottage after dark, she opened another ledger and began reading with entirely different eyes. Every brief note carried weight now, because every sentence represented someone's real memory. His children stayed on the farm another year, promise kept, winter passed safely. Rose had reduced life-changing moments to simple lines because the people themselves already knew the rest of the story. Emily turned page after page, noticing something she had overlooked before. One name appeared again. It surfaced in different years, sometimes separated by 5 or 6 harvests. Unlike every other entry, Rose never added an explanation beside it. Only the name itself remained. Emily searched another ledger. There it was again. Then another volume, again. The same name repeated quietly across decades without a single note describing why. Emily slowly closed the book, realizing she had finally discovered the one person her grandmother had recorded more consistently than anyone else, yet whose story remained completely unwritten. The repeated name appeared in 12 separate entries, always written the same way. A. Vale. No explanation followed it, no address, no family reference, no note about illness, debt, frost, or harvest. Emily copied every year into her notebook, then spread the ledgers across the kitchen table until dawn paled the windows. The name began in 1967 and continued irregularly through Rose's later records. Each appearance stood alone, almost like a marker, and the torn sections clustered near the same years. By morning, she knew she needed Sophia. Sophia arrived after 10, carrying an archival case, a camera, and a magnifying lamp. She examined the damaged ledger first, then several others from the hidden room. "These pages weren't lost naturally," she said. "Someone removed them carefully." "Can you tell when?" "Not exactly, but look here." Sophia pointed to faint fibers and a narrow line of darker residue near the spine. "The cuts were made with a thin blade, not torn by hand. And the paper dust is older than the surface dust on the cover. Whoever did this removed the pages years ago." Emily showed her the repeated name. Sophia compared the entries, then photographed each one. A veil could be a person, an alias, even a place. "But the handwriting is definitely Rose's." Why leave the name and remove the explanations? Maybe the name was harmless without the context. Sophia turned to another ledger and stopped. There's something else. Along the inner margin, nearly invisible beneath age stains, remained the bottom halves of several handwritten letters where a page had been cut too close to the binding. Sophia adjusted the light. This looks like part of a date, and here possibly the word county. Emily leaned closer. Can we recover more? Not from what remains here, but records mentioned in the missing pages may exist elsewhere. They spent the next 2 hours building a list of years connected to the cuts. Sophia suggested tax rolls, agricultural reports, county loan notices, and local newspapers. By early afternoon, Emily drove into town while Sophia continued photographing the ledgers. The county archive filled the courthouse basement with rows of brittle documents. Emily searched harvest reports first. Several missing years matched severe regional losses: a late frost in 1971, flooding in 1976, and a vine disease outbreak in 1984. Then she found a county relief register from 1976. One line mentioned emergency funds distributed through a private guarantor whose identity had been withheld. Beside the entry was a handwritten notation: Vale account. Emily's pulse quickened. She requested the related file, but the clerk returned with an empty folder. The contents were withdrawn years ago, he said. By whom? No record. Another dead end. Outside the courthouse, Emily found Victor Langford waiting beside his black SUV. Miss Carter, he said, you've been difficult to reach. I didn't realize you were trying. I called the cottage twice. Emily had heard the phone ring that morning, but ignored it while working with Sophia. Victor held out a revised offer. This is considerably higher than the last one. She did not take it. Why the urgency? His smile tightened. Because abandoned vineyards deteriorate quickly. Every week increases restoration costs. That sounds like my problem. It becomes yours only if you insist on keeping it. Impatience slipped through his polished tone. You inherited a romantic idea, not a functioning estate. Maybe value isn't always measured by production. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. Sentiment is expensive. So is persistence. She walked past him before he could answer. When she returned to Willow Creek, Sophia had arranged the photographed pages in chronological order. The missing sections cluster around years of crisis. Sophia said, and a vale appears either just before or just after nearly every cluster. Emily told her about the relief register and the empty county file. Sophia frowned. Then the missing pages may have documented financial help. Or who provided it? A knock sounded at the door. Daniel stood outside, his face unusually grave. He glanced past Emily toward the ledgers covering the table. You've been busy. We found traces from the pages that were cut out, Emily said. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Sophia gathered her equipment. I'll finish the copies tomorrow, she said before leaving. Once they were alone, Emily placed the damaged ledger in front of Daniel. You knew these pages were missing. He looked at the exposed binding for a long moment. Yes. Did Rose remove them? Daniel slowly shook his head. I did. The admission struck harder than Emily expected. Why? Because she asked me to. When? Years ago. After she realized some people had started asking questions about the old vintages, Emily opened her notebook. Who is A. Vale? Daniel's gaze moved toward the darkening vineyard outside. A name Rose used when the truth needed protection. Protection from whom? Not from one person, he said. From shame, pride, banks, families who might lose everything if their private troubles became public. Emily struggled to keep her voice steady. Where are the pages now, Safe? Then give them to me. Daniel looked at her with sorrow rather than defiance. I promised Rose they would stay hidden until the keeper understood what they could destroy as well as what they could save. She called me the keeper? Yes, then let me decide. Daniel closed the ledger gently. Not yet. Emily stared at him, anger rising beneath her grief. You don't get to decide what my grandmother left me. No, Daniel said quietly, but I do have to keep the last promise I made her. He stepped toward the door, then paused with one hand on the frame. Rose didn't remove those pages to hide the help she gave. She removed them because the records protected a secret much larger than anyone in this valley ever knew. Daniel returned the following morning before Emily had decided whether she was ready to forgive him. He stood on the porch holding a narrow wooden case darkened by age, his hat clutched in both hands. You were right, he said. Rose chose you. I don't have the right to keep giving you half the truth. Emily let him inside without answering. He placed the case on the kitchen table, but did not open it. Rain had begun beyond the windows, falling softly across the neglected vines. The valley remembers the good harvests, Daniel said. People celebrate the years when barrels were full and prices were high. Rose remembered the bad ones. He opened one of the vintage records to 1971. A late frost destroyed nearly half the crop. Small growers couldn't repay their loans. Banks gave them 30 days before foreclosure. Emily recognized several names on the page. Margaret Ellis, one of them. Rose took 12 bottles from her private reserve and sent them to an auction in Portland. They were worth more than Margaret ever knew. Daniel turned to another year. In 1976, the creek flooded. It ruined equipment, cellars, and entire fields. Rose sold a founder's harvest through a broker and used the money to guarantee emergency loans. The Vale account, Emily said. Daniel nodded. Vale wasn't a person. It stood for Anonymous Valley. Emily looked down at the repeated entries. The mysterious name had not concealed one beneficiary. It had concealed all of them. Daniel continued through droughts, illnesses, accidents, and seasons when growers had been forced to choose between paying workers and feeding their families. Each time, Rose quietly removed bottles from the hidden reserve. Rare vintages that collectors would have paid extraordinary prices to own were sold through distant brokers so no one in the valley could trace the money back to Willow Creek. Why hide it? Emily asked. Because people here were proud. Many would have refused charity. Others might have been ruined if creditors learned how desperate they were. Daniel touched the damaged binding. The missing pages recorded exact payments, debts, and family circumstances. Rose feared those details could shame the very people she had helped. Emily thought of her grandmother's modest clothes, the patched gardening gloves, and the old car she had driven until it barely ran. Rose had owned bottles valuable enough to transform her own life. Yet she had sold them one by one for strangers and neighbors. Our family thought she was careless with money. Emily said, They said Willow Creek failed because she didn't understand business. Daniel gave a sad smile. Rose understood value better than any of them. He opened the wooden case. Inside lay the pages removed from the ledgers, each protected between sheets of thin paper. Emily reached toward them, then stopped. She suddenly understood Daniel's hesitation. The pages were not treasure maps. They contained the most vulnerable moments of real families. I don't need to read every private detail, she said. Relief crossed Daniel's face. That was what Rose hoped you would understand. But I need to know enough to protect what she built. Then read the totals, the dates, and the bottles sold. Leave the personal accounts sealed. Together they reviewed the financial summaries. The numbers revealed decades of sacrifice. Rose had repeatedly surrendered the finest wines Willow Creek produced, often keeping only one bottle from each vintage as a record. The hidden chamber was not a collection waiting to make its owner wealthy. It was what remained after a lifetime of quiet giving. By afternoon, Emily carried the ledgers back to the cellar. She moved more slowly among the bottles now. Each one represented a choice Rose had made: comfort or compassion, recognition or privacy, profit or another family's survival. When she returned upstairs, Victor Langford was waiting beside the front gate. He had come without his usual smile. "Daniel told you," he said. Emily stopped several feet away. "How do you know?" "Because I recognized the pattern years ago." Victor looked toward the vineyard. "My father's name is in those records." Emily said nothing. "He was a field worker," Victor continued. "When I was 9, he was injured during harvest. We had no insurance and nowhere to go. Rose paid the medical bills and arranged work for my mother." His voice remained controlled. But shame tightened his expression. "She made certain I stayed in school." "Then why are you trying to take this place from me? I'm trying to preserve it." "By buying it before I understood what it was," Victor exhaled sharply. "Willow Creek could become a respected label again. The hidden vintages, Rose's story, the families she saved. We could build an international brand around them." Emily stared at him. "You want to sell their hardship?" "I want to turn sacrifice into something sustainable. By putting their names on bottles with permission, carefully managed, a portion of the profits could support local growers." His argument was polished and practical, but Emily heard what was missing. Rose had never helped people so the world would applaud her. Victor wanted to transform secrecy into marketing, gratitude into ownership, and memory into a product. "She helped your family without asking for anything," Emily said. "And you came here hoping to buy her legacy before anyone else discovered it." Victor's face hardened. "Kindness without capital eventually dies. Look around you. The vineyard is abandoned. The cottage is failing. Sentiment won't repair either. Neither will exploiting people who trusted her. Think carefully. Emily, good intentions destroyed this place once." He returned to his SUV and drove away through the rain. Emily remained at the gate, angry not because Victor had lied, but because part of what he said was true. Willow Creek needed money, labor, and a future. Rose's methods had saved others, while slowly exhausting the vineyard itself. That evening, Emily returned to the hidden reserve. She examined the bottle racks, searching for any guidance Rose might have left about what came next. Near the lowest shelf, she noticed a narrow brass plate marked with the number 7. Remembering the tiny key recovered from the 1984 bottle, she hurried upstairs and retrieved it from the envelope. The key fit the plate perfectly. A concealed drawer opened beneath the rack. Inside, resting alone on dark velvet, was a larger iron key. The final key Rose had hidden for her. Emily held the larger iron key in her hand for several moments before moving. Unlike the tiny brass key hidden inside the bottle, this one carried obvious weight. Its dark surface had been polished smooth by years of handling, and a small grapevine had been carved into its round bow. Rose had expected someone to find it eventually, but only after discovering every clue that had come before. Emily slipped the key into her pocket and carefully closed the hidden drawer. She resisted the temptation to search the cellar wildly. Her grandmother had never hidden anything carelessly. Every step had followed another. Every discovery had required patience. She walked through the underground rooms once more, studying the map she had copied from the ledger. The final marking no longer pointed only to the reserve room. Looking more closely beneath her flashlight, she noticed another faint line she had overlooked before. It extended beyond the reserve, ending beneath the oldest section of the cottage foundation. Emily returned upstairs and compared the drawing with the floor plan of the house. The location corresponded to a narrow storage room beside the original kitchen pantry, a room she had barely entered because it contained only broken shelves and empty crates. She carried the flashlight upstairs and unlocked the small room. Dust covered everything. A cracked ladder leaned against one wall, while old fruit baskets were stacked in a corner. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then she remembered the map. The markings sat lower than floor level. She knelt and began moving the empty crates aside. Beneath them lay an old wooden trapdoor almost completely hidden beneath decades of dust. Iron hinges secured one side, a heavy lock protected the other. Emily reached into her pocket. The iron key fit perfectly. The lock resisted at first before finally turning with a deep, metallic click that echoed through the quiet cottage. She lifted the trapdoor slowly. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the familiar scent of old oak and aging wine. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Emily switched on her flashlight and carefully climbed down. The chamber below was larger than she expected, its ceiling supported by thick wooden beams blackened with age. Unlike the reserve room, this space had never been intended for storage alone. Wooden cabinets lined one wall. A long work table occupied the center. Shelves held carefully labeled boxes and binders rather than wine. At the far end stood another rack containing only 12 bottles, each separated inside individual wooden compartments. Every bottle bore a handwritten label reading simply, "Keeper's Reserve," followed by a year. Emily slowly walked through the room, overwhelmed by the care with which everything had been preserved. She opened one cabinet. Inside rested neatly organized folders containing harvest summaries, receipts from distant wine auctions, handwritten correspondence with brokers, and yearly accounting ledgers. None of the documents revealed the names of families Rose had helped. Instead, they recorded only bottle numbers, sale prices, and amounts distributed through the anonymous Valley account. Emily understood immediately why Daniel had protected the missing pages. Rose had separated financial records from personal stories. The families remained anonymous while the history of the sacrifices survived. Piece by piece, the entire system became clear. Rare vintages had been quietly sold through collectors outside the valley. The money returned anonymously whenever local growers faced disaster. The vintage records documented the human side. The accounting books preserved the practical side. Together they told one complete story. Emily sat quietly at the work table for several minutes, absorbing what her grandmother had built alone over decades. It had never been a business designed to grow wealthy. It had been a promise carefully maintained harvest after harvest. She continued examining the room until she discovered several archival boxes containing photographs. Many showed familiar faces from the valley standing beside healthy vineyards years before Emily had been born. Rose appeared in only a handful of pictures, usually standing near the edge rather than at the center. She smiled quietly while others celebrated around her. Emily smiled through tears. That was exactly how she remembered her grandmother. Never seeking attention, always making sure someone else received it. Near the photographs rested a sealed wooden case. Inside lay every surviving vintage record arranged in perfect chronological order, including duplicate handwritten indexes that cross-referenced harvest years, bottle sales, and anonymous distributions. Sophia would immediately recognize their historical value. More importantly, Emily realized the collection finally answered nearly every question she had carried since arriving at Willow Creek. The abandoned vineyard had never failed because Rose made poor business decisions. It had slowly emptied because its greatest treasures had continually left the cellar to rescue other families. As she gently returned the documents to their places, something resting alone on the far corner of the work table caught her attention. It was an old portable cassette recorder connected to a small speaker, remarkably well protected beneath a cloth cover. Beside it rested a single cassette tape. A handwritten label bore only 3 words: "For Emily only." Emily carefully lifted the recorder onto the table. Fresh batteries had been stored beside it inside a sealed package, along with a short handwritten instruction from Rose. "If time has reached this room before you have, replace the batteries first." Emily smiled softly at the familiar practicality of the note. She inserted the new batteries, closed the compartment, and held the cassette in her hands. Her thumb rested lightly against the play button. After weeks of following hidden ledgers, forgotten bottles, anonymous records, and carefully protected memories, she realized her grandmother had left one final conversation waiting in complete silence. Emily pressed the play button. For several seconds, the cassette produced only a low mechanical hiss. Then Rose's voice filled the hidden room, older and softer than Emily remembered, yet unmistakably hers. "My dear Emily, if you are hearing this, then you found the records, the reserve, and the truth I was too afraid to place in anyone else's hands." Emily covered her mouth as tears rose without warning. Rose paused on the recording as though gathering courage across the years. "Our family believed Willow Creek was a vineyard. It was never only that. A harvest gives what the land can spare, and a life should do the same. I sold the best vintages because there were seasons when our neighbors needed them more than I did. I kept their names private because help loses its dignity when it becomes a performance." Emily sat at the work table, listening as her grandmother explained that the anonymous Valley account had protected families through frost, flood, illness, and debt. Rose never described herself as generous. She spoke instead about promises, practical choices, and the duty of those who had enough to notice those who did not. "You may sell Willow Creek," Rose continued. "I will not ask you to sacrifice your future for my past, but before you decide, let the Valley know what these records mean. Not the private details, never those. Tell them only that they survived together, even when they believed they survived alone." The tape clicked softly. Then Rose's voice returned for one final sentence. "You were never the disappointment they called you, Emily. You were the one person I trusted to understand that feeding people and saving them are sometimes the same act." The recording ended. Emily remained in the underground room until the flashlight dimmed. All her life, she had measured herself against people who considered stability more honorable than compassion. Rose had seen value where everyone else saw impracticality in Emily, in the vineyard, and in the families recorded across those fragile pages. By morning, grief had settled into something clearer. Emily called Sophia and Daniel. Together they prepared a careful summary of the vintage records, removing every private name and medical detail. Sophia created copies of the harvest accounts, while Daniel selected photographs that showed the valley without exposing anyone's hardship. They invited longtime families to the cottage that afternoon. Word spread faster than Emily expected. By sunset, more than 30 people stood beneath the old oak tree near the vineyard rows. Some had already shared their stories with her. Others arrived uncertain why Rose's granddaughter had called them together. Emily placed one ledger on a small table but kept it closed. "My grandmother recorded every harvest at Willow Creek," she began, "but the records were never really about wine." She explained the private auctions, the anonymous Valley account, and the rare bottles sold whenever local growers faced disaster. She did not reveal who had received money or how much. She spoke only of the system Rose had quietly maintained for decades. Silence followed. Then Margaret Ellis's daughter stepped forward. "My mother always believed Rose saved only us." Thomas Reed's grandson shook his head. "So did my family." Similar confessions moved through the gathering, one by one. People realized that what they had considered isolated acts of kindness belonged to a much larger legacy. Some wept. Others laughed softly at Rose's determination to remain invisible. Daniel stood beside Emily, his eyes lowered beneath the brim of his hat. Sophia carefully displayed the photographs and accounting summaries. No one demanded access to the sealed personal pages. Instead, families began offering their own memories, filling the gaps Rose had protected. An older grower remembered equipment appearing after a flood. A widow recalled an anonymous payment that prevented foreclosure. A former field worker described a scholarship delivered without a signature. The community had not survived through luck. They had survived because Rose repeatedly transformed wine into time, dignity, and another chance. Victor arrived near the end of the gathering. He stopped outside the circle, visibly unsettled by the people surrounding the cottage. Emily watched recognition pass across several faces. He had built Langford Estates into the largest producer in the region. Yet here he was, still the child whose family had once needed Rose's help. "You told them," he said when the gathering quieted. "I told them what belonged to all of them," Emily replied. Victor looked at the closed ledger, and the names still protected. Some tension left his shoulders. He stepped toward the group and faced the people he had spent years approaching as competitors, suppliers, or potential acquisitions. "My father was injured during harvest when I was 9, he said. His voice lacked its usual polish. Rose paid his medical bills. She found work for my mother and made sure I stayed in school." He looked toward the neglected vines. "Everything I built began with help I never publicly acknowledged." No one answered immediately. Victor's discomfort deepened, but he continued. "I wanted to buy Willow Creek and turn Rose's history into a brand. I told myself that was preservation. It was also ambition." Emily heard no excuse in his admission, only the first honest words he had offered since arriving at the cottage. "Would you still buy it?" she asked. Victor met her gaze. "Yes, the land has value. The remaining vintages have more. But I understand now that ownership would not give me the right to use these stories." His answer returned the decision fully to her. Keeping Willow Creek meant repairs she could barely afford, vines that might never recover, and work far beyond her experience. Selling could secure her future immediately. Rose had given her permission to walk away. That freedom made the choice harder, not easier. Over the following days, offers of help arrived from across the valley. Families volunteered tools, labor, cuttings, and knowledge. Sophia proposed preserving the records through the county museum while keeping sensitive pages sealed. Daniel showed Emily which vineyard rows still held living roots beneath the neglect. Even Victor sent a written promise that he would respect whatever she decided. The annual Harvest Festival was approaching, and the town council invited Emily to speak about Rose before the closing celebration. She accepted without revealing her decision. On the evening of the festival, lanterns glowed above the town square while growers, workers, and families gathered before a small wooden stage. Emily waited behind the curtain holding Rose's first vintage record against her chest. In her pocket rested Victor's final purchase offer. Beyond the stage, Daniel and Sophia stood among the crowd. Emily heard her name announced. She stepped into the light, placed the ledger on the podium, and looked across the valley her grandmother had quietly held together. Then she unfolded the paper containing her decision. Emily unfolded the paper beneath the festival lights. But instead of reading Victor's purchase offer, she tore it carefully in half. A murmur moved through the crowd. She placed the pieces beside the vintage record and looked toward the faces gathered before her. "Willow Creek is not for sale," she said. For one heartbeat, the square remained silent. Then applause rose from somewhere near the back, followed by another burst near the stage. Daniel removed his hat and lowered his head. Sophia smiled through tears. Emily gripped the podium until her hands stopped trembling. My grandmother did not preserve this vineyard because she believed land mattered more than people. She preserved it because the land gave her a way to help people. I cannot promise Willow Creek will become successful again. I cannot promise every vine will survive. But I can promise that Rose Bennett's work will not be turned into a product, and it will not disappear. Margaret Ellis's daughter began clapping harder. Soon the entire square joined her. Emily waited until the sound softened. The cottage will become a place where the valley's history can be remembered without exposing the private struggles Rose protected. The vintage records will be restored, copied, and preserved. The personal pages will remain sealed unless the families named in them choose otherwise. She glanced toward Sophia, who nodded. And the Anonymous Valley Fund will begin again. It will support small growers facing the same kinds of hardships Rose spent her life answering. This time, the applause felt different. It was not celebration alone, it was commitment. People turned toward one another as though finally recognizing that they had inherited Rose's promise too. After Emily stepped from the stage, Daniel met her at the stairs. "You understand now," he said. "I think I'm beginning to—" He looked at the torn offer on the podium. "That decision won't make the roof stop leaking." Emily laughed softly. "I know." "Good. Your grandmother always distrusted people who confused courage with planning." The next morning, the first volunteers arrived at Willow Creek before Emily had finished her coffee. Thomas Reed's grandson brought fencing supplies. The Brooks family delivered roof shingles. Several growers came with pruning tools and cuttings from vines descended from old Willow Creek stock. No one waited to be assigned. They simply began. Practical problems appeared immediately. 2 roof beams were weaker than expected. The irrigation channel behind the lower rows had collapsed. Mold had damaged part of the pantry wall. Emily kept a growing list on the kitchen door and learned to accept that every repaired problem revealed another. Yet for the first time, the work did not feel like proof that she had inherited a burden. It felt like evidence that the cottage still belonged to a living community. Victor arrived 3 days later, in work clothes instead of his usual charcoal coat. He carried a folder but did not attempt to enter until Emily invited him. "I came to make an offer," he said. Emily raised an eyebrow. "I thought we settled that, not to buy the property." He placed the folder on the kitchen table. Inside was a donation agreement transferring funds and equipment to the renewed Anonymous Valley program without naming rights ownership or advertising privileges. "No Langford label?" Emily asked. "No label, no photographs." "None." Victor looked through the open window toward the volunteers repairing the trellises. "Rose gave my family a future without asking us to display our gratitude. I can do the same." Emily studied the agreement. Sophia had already recommended an independent community board to manage donations, and Victor's contribution would fund emergency grants for several years. "The board will decide how it's used." Emily said, "Not you, not me." Agreed. She signed only after Sophia reviewed every page. Victor did not ask for thanks. Before leaving, he walked to the vineyard and spent an hour helping Daniel clear a blocked drainage ditch. Their conversation remained tense, but they worked side by side. Winter arrived before the restoration was complete. The volunteers repaired the roof and stabilized the cellar, but most vineyard rows had to wait until spring. Inside the cottage, Sophia transformed the front room into a small exhibition space. Photographs showed harvests, workers, families, and the changing valley. Copies of selected vintage record pages appeared behind protective glass, with names removed wherever privacy required it. The original ledgers remained in archival cases inside the hidden records room, while the missing personal pages were sealed in the wooden box Daniel had protected, above the fireplace. Emily placed Rose's handwritten sentence, "Some harvests are too important to measure by profit." They called the place the Willow Creek Harvest House. It opened quietly on the first warm Saturday of spring. No ribbon was cut, no reporters were invited. Families entered carrying photographs, letters, and memories of their own. Children listened as their grandparents explained how the valley had survived frost, flood, and debt. Some visitors recognized years in the records, but chose not to speak. Emily understood that silence could also be a form of dignity. The vineyard recovered slowly. Daniel taught her how to identify living wood beneath damaged bark, where to cut, and when patience mattered more than action. Emily's hands blistered during the first weeks. She ruined a section of young vines by tying them too tightly and cried alone behind the equipment shed. Daniel found her there, cut the bindings loose, and showed her how to begin again. "Vines forgive careful people," he said. Eventually, she continued cooking in the cottage kitchen, feeding volunteers with soups, fresh bread, and meals made from whatever neighbors brought. Rose's final message stayed with her each time someone gathered around the long table. Feeding people and saving them were sometimes the same act. By the following autumn, Willow Creek produced its first modest harvest in years. The yield was too small for commercial production, but no one treated it as failure. Families arrived before sunrise carrying baskets and shears. Daniel directed the older workers, while Sophia photographed only those who agreed. Victor came with his mother, who stood quietly beneath the old oak tree before placing a handwritten account of Rose's kindness into the community archive. At sunset, the final baskets were carried into the restored cellar. Emily selected a small portion of grapes for the first new vintage and set aside the rest for a valley celebration. She did not know whether the wine would be extraordinary. That no longer seemed like the most important measure. Later, after everyone had gone home, Emily sat alone at Rose's old desk. The cottage settled around her with familiar creaks. Through the open cellar door came the scent of oak, earth, and freshly pressed grapes. She placed a new leather-bound ledger beside the original vintage records. Its pages were blank, its cover unmarked. For a moment she hesitated, feeling the weight of everything that had brought her there: rejection, grief, hidden rooms, missing pages, and a grandmother's faith preserved across decades. Then she dipped her pen into the ink. At the top of the first page, she wrote the year. Beneath it, she recorded the condition of the vines, the size of the harvest, and the names of everyone who had helped restore Willow Creek. Finally, she added the first sentence of the new record. "Every harvest is measured not by the wine we keep, but by the lives we help grow." Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't measured in money, land, or possessions, but in the quiet choices that shape other people's lives long after we're gone. Emily believed she had inherited nothing more than a forgotten cottage and a dying vineyard, only to discover that the true legacy waiting for her was one of compassion, humility, and unwavering generosity. Rose Bennett never sought recognition for the lives she changed because she understood that genuine kindness asks for no applause in the end. Willow Creek was restored not by wealth alone, but by a community united through gratitude, trust, and shared purpose. May this story remind us that the smallest acts of kindness often leave the deepest roots, and that the richest harvest any of us can hope to leave behind is not what we keep for ourselves, but what we help others grow.